wheel. One of the most important inventions/discoveries in human history. We've used it to go places, record music, harness energy, make stuff, gamble ourselves into poverty, and torture heretics. It's one of the keystones of ancient civilization as well as modern civilization, and it's never going away. As long as humanity exists, our need for wheels will exist alongside us, because humanity has an all-encompassing obsession with efficiency, and nothing is more efficient than something round. Nature is mostly round for this reason. Take a look at a flower, take a look at a tomato, take a look at that big glowing thing in the sky that keeps you from freezing to death. Due to naturally occurring forces like gravity and a few others I'm too lazy to research, round is how everything, and I mean literally everything, ends up if left to its own devices, because it's simply the most efficient way to do things. Round maximizes capacity while minimizing exposure, whether that exposed area is relatively spherical like a bubble or the sun or your head, or circular and flat like a wheel. Or a city. Wait a minute, you say, cities aren't like wheels. Cities are built on a grid, so they must be rectangles. The neighborhood I live in is a rectangle, the office building where I work is a rectangle. My entire city is nothing but rectangles. There's no wheel anywhere. First of all, yes, there is a wheel, you just don't know where to look for it. And second, stop interrupting me and let me get to the point of this video, i.e., the hub and spoke system of urban distribution, which is as widespread as it is necessary as it is unavoidable. Every city in human history operates on hub and spoke architecture, particularly as it relates to transportation of people and resources, and every city in the world is, without exception, modeled like a wheel. Let's go back to the founding of the average European Bronze Age settlement. Basically, thousands of years ago, a bunch of Europeans got together and decided they were tired of all this hunter-gatherer crap, so they turned to other methods of survival, namely agriculture. They started doing the fishing thing, the farming thing, the hut building thing, and they constructed the means of survival rather than searching for it. Agrarian society minus a dependable source of fresh water equals a bunch of dead and/or starving people, which is why so many early settlements, and therefore so many modern cities, are built around rivers. See London, Paris, Rome, Madrid, Warsaw, Berlin, Moscow, and so on. The river itself is the object around which the settlement forms. The need to keep important things convenient and predictable encouraged people to congregate around riverbanks. Eventually, as more kids were born and more immigrants arrived at these settlements, new families would migrate to the other side of the river so they would have easier access to more farmland without direct competition with other families. The need to trade and socialize with people on both sides of the river would result in the construction of a river crossing, and many of those crossings were centered around islands in the middle of the rivers because islands make river crossing easier. Rome, again, here's Tiber Island in the middle of the Tiber River, which has had 2 bridges connected to it since antiquity. Paris, again, here's Ile de la Cité, which has 10 bridges, and Ile Saint-Louis immediately next door, which has 6. River crossings, and not the rivers themselves, were the real hubs of agrarian civilization. Instances of riverfront property are numerous and spread out, whereas crossings are centralized, specialized, and ultimately rare. And because they were rare, they became attractive, potentially even more attractive than the rivers they crossed. Hubs are what people congregate around because all hubs provide something that the average person can't be bothered to provide for themselves. And once a hub is established, everything else in the city radiates from that hub, barring environmental limits. Think about going camping with a big group of people. What's the first thing everyone does the instant the sun starts setting? You build a fire. Then everyone gathers around the fire for purposes of cooking dinner and having conversation and tolerating the token attention-starved jerk as he plays Wonderwall on his improperly tuned acoustic guitar. The campfire is your hub because it's attractive and useful and it provides something for the entire population that they would rather not provide for themselves. When you go camping, nobody makes their own fire inside their tent. One centralized fire pit is plenty for these several people on the camping trip, just as one bridge is enough for this settlement of 100 pre-industrial Europeans. However, populations grow. In settlements, I mean, not on camping trips unless those co-eds you brought with you have miraculously short gestation periods. In our European settlement, a decade later, let's say the population of this successful town has tripled. You still have all these folks living on either side of the river, congregated primarily around the bridge, but now you've also got all these other people living up north and down south because they needed their own slice of riverfront property in order to make their farms viable. So maybe they build their own river crossings on the north end and the south end because it becomes more pragmatic than traveling to the old bridge every day. Plus, the population on the north side of town and the south side of town each have about the same population the entire town had when they built the first bridge, so why not? So now the north side has a bridge, the south side has a bridge, and nobody from the north side or the south side ever visits the central bridge ever again, right? Wrong, because in that decade since the first bridge was built, more and more stuff has built up immediately around it. You've got your marketplace over here, your religious temple over here, your chieftain's house, your amphitheater, your pub, your brothel, and so on. Remember Ile de la Cité in Paris, that island in the middle of the Seine River with all the bridges connected to it? It's smack in the middle of the first 6 arrondissements in the center of the city. It's more or less the center of the entire metropolitan area. It's actually the de facto center of the entire country. All road instances in France are calculated from a courtyard on the eastern side of the island. What's so special about that courtyard? Oh, nothing much. It's just a little patch of land in front of Notre Dame Cathedral, which happens to be next to the oldest functioning hospital in the entire world, which is just down the street from the city's police headquarters, which is a quick jog from the former royal palace, which is a stone's throw away from Jesus' crown of thorns, a piece of the cross he hung on, and a fragment of the lance of Longinus. And here's the subway station. And that's just a rundown of what's still standing today. Ile de la Cité and the original settlement that occupied and surrounded it has been around a lot longer than the nation of France or the city of Paris. It started out as farmland and low-rise housing, just like every other city and every other continent in every other time period, and grew into the cultural behemoth it is today because of humanity's tendency to cluster, gravitate, densify. Hubs not only attract people, they attract more attractions, which is why the center of any given city is always the place to be, and the outlying areas are considerably less important. This is also why cities almost always get bigger and almost never become smaller. Sorry, Detroit. Oh, speaking of Detroit, let's return to the subject of wheels. Back at our theoretical European settlement, the joint is getting so big and so important that the local contingent of barbarians is starting to show interest in raiding. That livestock you've got there is looking pretty tasty. Those thatch roof cottages are looking awfully flammable. Hey, I hear their co-eds have really short gestation periods. We should invade. The settlement's chieftain notices the horde and thinks, maybe I should do something about this. So he decides to build a fence. Now obviously the chieftain has a few things to consider here when it comes to the ins and outs of how and where to build the fence. Nah, just kidding, this is a no-brainer. He builds a round fence because it protects and surrounds the greatest amount of space with the lowest amount of materials. Problem solved. See, the city has its hub, its first river crossing. As the settlement ages, the people there will establish paths or roads that proceed out from the hub and into the residential outskirts. Those are the spokes. And the fence is the rim. Hub, spokes, rim, a wheel. This is the natural progression of every city in the entire world, even if the hubs and rims don't serve the same purpose throughout history as they did at the dawn of civilization. Now, the obvious counterargument to this claim is that all modern cities operate on a grid pattern, not a circular pattern. Well, yeah, but all the city grids we have today still operate within the context of the greater, larger wheel, and that goes back to the human obsession with efficiency. On the micro level, yes, cities are sectioned off as rectangles, but only because we'd waste a whole lot of space if every plot of land inside a city were circular. If every person or every business operated inside of a circular building, we would forfeit all this space between those circles. So we grid everything off instead because it's the most efficient move. Remember Ile Saint-Louis in Paris, the one right next to Ile de la Cité? Rectangular grid. Other parts of the city? Mostly rectangular, mostly gridded, even though Paris is a really old city and formal strategic urban planning hadn't quite taken hold yet when it was being built. However, zoom out a bit and you can easily see the hub, spokes, and rim of the city wheel. Ile de la Cité, hub, various major thoroughfares, spokes, Boulevard Périphérique, rim. There's your wheel. Take a look at the metro, Paris's subway system. There's your hub ever so slightly north of Ile de la Cité, and there are your spokes shooting out in every direction. This pattern of urban distribution as it relates to transportation and density exists in younger cities too. Here's Denver, the 17th largest metropolitan area in the United States, founded roughly 2,000 years after the Parisi first set up shop on Ile de la Cité. Denver follows the typical post-industrial revolution American car-centric school of urban planning. Micro-level grid, grid everywhere, grids inside grids, but zoom out until you're looking at the entire city and not just selected portions of it. See, the city center is the hub, the spokes are the interstates and other major highways, the rim is Highway 470, which laps around the entire environment. Well, okay, almost the entire environment. And here's what Denver's train system will look like in about 10 years. Hub, Union Station, spokes, everything else. Here's Houston, Texas. Houston is the ultimate example of a modern landlocked American city, and is such an absolute nightmare of unchecked Midwestern sprawl that when the band Arcade Fire recorded their Grammy-winning album about it, there was really only one appropriate choice for a title. Here's the downtown area, grid. Zoom out, hub, spokes, rim. Zoom out further. Houston is so huge of a city that the first wheel rim becomes a hub itself, and a new rim circles around it. Zoom out more. Look at all those spokes, I count at least a dozen. And see the unconnected orange road over there on the west side of town? That's Texas Highway 99, also known as the Grand Parkway. Yeah, guess what? That's going to be another rim someday at a total length of over 180 miles. Seriously, you can look it up. Wait a minute, you're still saying. My city isn't a circle, not even close. Yeah, you live in Miami or Istanbul or Chicago or Buenos Aires or Vancouver or Tokyo or Boston or Jakarta or some other city next to a gigantic body of water, right? I mentioned earlier in the video that cities always radiate out from their hubs, and I stand by that word, radiate, because it's the best way to describe the natural growth of a city. But I also mentioned that this radiation is subject to environmental limitations. Those limitations can be anything, Lake Michigan in the case of Chicago, the Pacific Ocean in the case of Los Angeles, and so on. Water's not the only limiting factor, though. The circularity of Seoul, South Korea is prevented by mountains. Here, all over the place. Cairo, Egypt is shaped and constrained by the surrounding desert. Oh hey, speaking of Cairo, look, islands in the river. Only 2 bridges in the Cairo metropolitan area don't touch an island. More than a dozen of the city's bridges involve islands. What did I tell you about the importance of islands inside rivers? Neat, huh? Even if a given city isn't a perfect circle, every city is trying to be circular, and it would be circular if it didn't have to compete against Mother Nature for the real estate. Every city has a hub-and-spoke system ingrained in its architecture, whether the city has been around for thousands of years or was just built in 1960. Looking at you, Brasilia. And decades from now, when we go colonize the moon and Mars, the first thing those cosmic urban planners are going to do is scope out the flattest, barest, widest, most boring plot of land they can find. Because that kind of land, similar to the land that Houston, Paris, Moscow, Beijing, or Bangalore occupy, doesn't have any major environmental limits to contend with. Then they're going to plop the colony as close to the middle of that land as they can in order to facilitate the easiest possible expansion in all directions in the same hub-and-spoke architecture we use on Earth. And all future development will spread out evenly and circularly just like a wheel. Not too far west, though, that's where all the Martian barbarians live.